Our next and unfortunately last speaker is Ignazio Angeloni, a specialist in the field of economics, finance, banking, and European integration. After getting an undergraduate degree at Bocconi in Milan and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, all in economics of course, he held positions at Italy's Ministry of Finance, the Bank of Italy, and the International Monetary Fund, as well as being a member of the Supervisory Board and head of the Financial Stability and Macroprudential Policy Department of the European Central Bank. And very many impressive, instructive and enlightening publications by Mr. Angeloni were released all over the world.
In this talk, Ignazio Angeloni is going to be talking about money. It plays a role in nearly every aspect of our lives, and we encounter it in many different forms. How do these forms work? Which alternatives are there to the conventional forms of money? And where is the value of the money rooted in? These questions will be answered by Mr. Angeloni. Mr. Angeloni, you have the stage.
I don't deserve an applause yet, so save it for later. Well, I'm really excited to be here, first of all. As I was telling Max and the other colleagues beforehand, it's the first time that I speak in a high school. I mean, I've been quite different places as a speaker, but never in a high school. So I think this is a challenge, because I'm looking forward to your questions. And it's something that really makes me very pleased. And as you've heard, the idea that we discussed together in preparing for this event was to discuss about digital money. It's a topic that is in the newspaper, it's a topic that the scientists, the economics are studying, it's a topic that the institutions are working on. So one needs to understand what is the reality behind it. There is a lot of talk. Okay? And there's a lot of writing about digital money. So different forms. We will see different forms of digital money. But we want to understand what the reality behind, or, as I try to express this, where the roots are. So I'm going to start with this. So this is a tree. It's beautiful, isn't it? It's arguably one of the most beautiful things on Earth, and it's also one of the most important things on Earth. We cannot live without trees. They can live very well without us, but we cannot live without trees. And yet there is something more important than trees. It's the roots. Actually, the tree cannot live without the roots, and the roots can live. If you cut the tree, the roots are still living, and maybe another tree will come up. So the root is not visible, it's not as beautiful as the tree outside, but it's more important than the tree itself. So this is an advice that I can give to you. You're starting not your life, but your career. Don't trust anything unless you understand where its roots are. And don't trust anybody unless you, thinking about it, you understand where the root of that person is, the cultural root, the ethic root, etc., etc. So I think this is actually the main takeaway from my talk. But let me continue. So we want to understand whether money has roots and where these roots are, what they consist of. And as you know, there are many different types of money, actually many more than here. So you see banknotes, US dollars, euros. You see cards. This is a credit card. Down there is a debit card. There's a Giro card. There is the apps, the modern apps, most used in the West here or even in China. Used also here. The Chinese apps are used. So there are different types of money, as we shall see. And there are the checks. This is the old-fashioned, the good old checks. Not much used in Germany anymore, but a lot of checks circulating in France, for example, or in America. In the US, they still use a lot of checks. Not so much here. So, what is money? There are many definitions. And economists have been working and writing about what is money, what the properties are for many, many centuries, actually, not decades, but centuries. Money is essentially a technology to transfer wealth. We all have wealth, more or less, a little bit. Somebody has a house, somebody else has a company, somebody else has a shop, etc. This is our wealth, or human wealth. The instruction, the education, the knowledge, the capability, etc. So we all have wealth, but we cannot transfer wealth. I mean, if I have a house and you have a company, and I have to give you something, I cannot give you a door of my house and you give me maybe a chair of your company. No, there's no coincidence of will in this exchange. So we need something that helps intermediate. And that thing has to be liquid. Liquid meaning that has to be fractioned in different amounts, and the different fractions of money have to be well recognized, and they have to have certain characteristics. First of all, it has to be stable in value, because money conveys signals, conveys information. And if the value changes over time very quickly, there's not much information in what money really is. Stable in value, and it also has to be easy to use. It has to be practical. So you have to be able to carry it with you. You have to be able to take it out easily, to exchange it. It has to be recognizable. People have to be able to understand what it is when it sees it, etc. So these are the roots of money, I shall argue. Stability, which is actually price stability, because price is the mirror image, the inverse of the value of money. So price stability, which, as we shall see, is the main task of the central banks, and easy to use. So the payment system has to work well. And there again is the central bank, together with the banks, that manage the payment system and ensure, according to certain rules, that the payment system works well. So if you think of the history of money is largely the history of how different civilizations have managed to satisfy, to give rise to a monetary means that satisfy these properties. And the history of money started about 5,000 years ago in a region which is today called Iraq. And used to be, at the time, used to be Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers. There are two rivers there. And that's where money originated from. And that's the form it took. So just about, I mean, it lasted very long, but just about 3,000 BC. So money for the Sumerians, the civilization was called the Sumerian civilization at the time. So money consisted in two things, barley and silver. Barley, you know what barley is? What is it? Graise in German. It's a cereal. It's a cereal. Is it graise? All right, so barley, you see it there. It's not so common, but so these were the values, and they were stored in a building like this, a temple. So the real value for the Sumerian was stored in a temple. And the temple was guarded by the priests. So the priests were sort of the ancient form of the central bankers. The central bankers were the priests at the time. And you know, for this type of work, there's little better than the priests. They were ensuring that this value, which were the property of people outside the temple, of course, were stored and recorded. Not only stored, but recorded. This belongs to one, this belongs to the other, etc. Outside of the temple, these things circulated. These are clay tablets. And Iraq is a very good place for clay tablets. There is good clay near the rivers. There is good water to shape the clay tablets. And there is good sun to dry them up. So they would write all the contracts, all the monetary contracts on these clay tablets, and then they would exchange. They would keep the clay tablets as a record of the transaction, and occasionally also exchange the clay tablets representing value which was inside the temple. It was a system that worked very well and for a very long time. In the end, it was destroyed by fire, but that's a different story. The next step is coins. Coins were not invented by the Romans. They were invented by the Greeks. But the Romans, like they imported many things from the Greeks, they also imported coinage. The good thing about coinage, from the point of view of easy to use and recognize, that the value is inherent. The value is inside the coin. The problem is that normal people like you and me, if you see a coin, you cannot determine how much value is inside. And the problem is that for the Romans, it was no longer the priests taking care of the value. It was the sovereign. And the sovereign could cheat. And they cheated. Oh, how much they cheated. I mean, in a little over 100 years, 161 is the beginning of the reign of Mark Aurel, of the emperor, Mark Aurel, Roman emperor. And 305 is the end of the reign of Diocletian. So 140 years, more or less, as you can see, the silver content, the metal content of coins lost almost all of its value. Simply, they were printing more and more coins with less and less silver content in order to be able to pay the soldiers, essentially, because that's the eternal problem of the sovereign, pay the soldiers. So this system was good, easy to use, but not stable in value. Remember the properties. Then, big jump to the 17th, 18th, 19th century. A system which worked very well for well over 100 years. It's called the gold standard. No longer silver, but gold. No longer coins or tablets, etc., but banknotes. Banknotes were actually invented by the Chinese in the 11th, 12th century, and were imported to the West by an Italian explorer, Marco Polo, who traveled in China. So the technique of banknote printing, but the underlying value was granted by gold, by the fact that the central banks, which were printing the banknotes, were committed to exchange banknotes, to withdraw banknotes in exchange for gold at fixed price. So the anchor was gold. Easy to use, banknotes, you keep it in your pocket easily, no weight, and stable in value as long as the gold is there in a good proportion with the banknotes. And the problem, that was precisely the problem. The problem is that the gold could not keep the right proportion with banknotes. In this period of time, about 160 years from 15, so the end of the Napoleon in France, up to 71, when the gold exchange standard was abolished by the Americans, in the 160 years, more or less, roughly, the amount of banknotes in the world increased by 18 times, and the amount of gold by 3 times only. So it was just very difficult to extract the gold from the earth in order to keep pace. So the danger was that there was not sufficient value to back this big amount of banknotes that the central banks and the governments were creating. So the gold standard collapsed in 1971. After that, you have to trust the central banks. There's no longer gold underneath the banknotes. The banknotes are still there, but you have to trust institutions which are in the business of regulating the amount of banknotes so that they keep the right proportion with no longer gold, which is very volatile. No longer gold, but goods, real goods that people buy. An index of consumer prices. So you may or may not trust the central banks. That's an issue. Not everybody trusts the central banks. But at least you know who they are, you know where they are, you know what rules they are supposed to follow. They are now compelled to speak to the public and explain and speak clearly, and they are subject to a certain accountability. They are independent, but up to a point. So this is called fiduciary money, and from 1971 is the regime that we live in now. Right. Let's go back to our monies, different forms, okay? So we have, again, the cards, the banknotes. a platform, a pure platform, PayPal. You have the apps, etc., and the good old checks, all different forms of money. Which ones of these monies are digital? The banknotes are not. The banknotes just circulate physically, so they're not digital. How about the others? I'm going to claim that all the others are digital. Even those which are made of plastic, even those which are made of paper, like the check, the apps, of course, PayPal, no question. All these are digital. Digital in the sense that the circulation and the accounting infrastructure that they rely on, the roots, are all in a digital system now. They didn't used to be, some of them at the beginning. The checks were, I mean, before 1955, the checks in everywhere, America, Europe, etc., all the circulation of checks was handled physically on paper. Now no longer. I mean, the check is just representing a digital amount, which is in the bank, which has a correspondence in accounts, also digital, of the banks with the central bank. So when you pay with a check, what happens when you pay with a check? Or when you pay with even a card or an app, for that matter. It means you send a signal, you go to your grocery store, okay, if they accept it. You pay with an app or you pay with a check. It means you get a signal, the receiving bank gets a signal, the signal goes to the issuing bank. There is an agreement to activate and move the electronic, the digital ledgers of these banks, and these banks, which have an account with the central bank, clear the transaction with the account of the central bank. Everything is digital. And if the transaction is cross-border, for example, in the euro area, so let's say Germany, Italy, or Germany, France, or Netherlands, etc., the banks have the national central banks have an account with the ECB in the payment system of the ECB, which is Target. It's called Target. And everything is almost instantly, not instantly, but almost settled with the central banks digitally. And all the others are digital. I mean, if you go, instead of writing a check, which is cumbersome and boring, you go with your smartphone, and you pay with the smartphone, contactless, or you go to Amazon, for example, you do a transaction, pay PayPal, it's exactly the same. Because, for example, PayPal, you have to have a credit card attached to it. Or you have to have a bank account, or you have to have a Giro card. And these are different modalities, but it's still the deposit that you have with the bank that is involved eventually. Okay, so all this is solidly rooted in a digital system, where there are authorities and private actors, because the banks are private, taking care of the good functionality of the payment system and of the stability of the value of money over time, making sure that there is no inflation. We will talk about inflation in a minute, I'm pretty sure. But this is the task of central bank, make the payment system work and ensure that the value of money is stable. So, as I said, all these, aside from the banknotes, which are deleted here, all the others, all payments go through banks and central banks. This is the important thing. So when we talk about digital money, there is a lot of chat now about digital money. Money is becoming digital. No, money is already digital since many decades ago, different forms of digital. But digitalization of money is an old thing. It's not of today. So that's important, I think, to understand. If you're interested in monetary economics, it's important to understand that in the system we have, and in the system that we've had since 1971 at least, central banks preserve the value of money, so the price stability, so-called price stability. They supervise, by and large, I mean, together with other institutions, but by and large, the central banks in most countries supervise the stability, the soundness of the banks. So make sure that the banks have a low probability of failing. Banks are risky institutions anyway, so they can fail, but making sure that they have a low probability, they are managed in a sound way, The banks operate the payment system, so there is an oversight on the payment system as well. And of course, there is an insurance. So small depositors, small quote unquote, because up to 100,000 in the whole of Europe, up to 100,000 euros of your deposits are insured. It meaning that if the bank fails, in a matter of 5 days, you get the money back. So it's a very sound system, which is costly in a sense, but it's a very reliable system to ensure payments and the value of money. Now, there are new digital monies. Of course, everybody talks about Bitcoin. And I'm sure you've heard also about stable coins. These are the two fashionable forms of crypto now. So Bitcoin, I'm pretty sure that some of you know much better than me what it is. It's a system of storing of money quote unquote, is not really money, as I shall explain, but balances stored in a system where each participant is a node in a network of computers. They have codes. One code is public, one is private, etc. Then there is a crypto system to send payment messages, and the payments get lined in chain blocks, and then they are validated. That's the key thing. So there's no, unlike all the other things that we've seen a minute ago, there's no banks involved. There's no deposits involved. There's no central bank involved. There's nothing of that sort. So it's completely different from everything that we have seen. And the payments, the validation of the payments, the approval of the payment, relies on particular operators, agents in this system, which are called miners, and they have to solve an electronic cryptographic problem. They have to solve a cryptographic problem using computer power, and they need a lot of computer power. And once they solve this, it's validated, it's accepted by the community, and the payment goes through. It takes time, takes a lot of energy to heat up, to cool off actually those computers. It takes a lot of computer. I mean, big miners have entire rooms of computers providing the necessary computing power. And it's a costly system. We will see it in a minute. So this is Bitcoin and a family of other cryptocurrencies, but they all basically function in a similar way. So the way that was initiated by a gentleman, or is it Satoshi Sakamoto in 2008. Nobody knows if this man exists, or maybe it's a woman, exists or not. Or maybe it's a computer who invented this thing. Nobody knows because he or she never showed up. But that's where it started, 2008. That's cryptocurrency. Stablecoin is something completely different. Stablecoin, they do not exist in Europe. They exist in the US. They're essentially banks, but they have a particular balance sheet. They have assets which are supposed to be very solid, like government bonds, currencies, bank deposits, etc. So a very solid, very stable set of assets on the asset side. On the liability, they offer monetary services or payment services. Okay, so they're like banks, except that they're not supervised now. Maybe they will be pretty soon, but at the moment they are not supervised. So nobody guarantees that the assets that they have are really solid, also because they are not subject to many accounting obligations, so nobody can see really the books of these things. And yet, they guarantee that on the liability side, $1 issued by Tether, for example, which is the most famous of them, $1 is equal to a real dollar, the dollar issued by the Federal Reserve. So these are the two types. Let's see a little bit. I mean, I put here some numbers. Don't take them at face value, because some of these things change over time. So I wanted to compare cost and time and speed and stability of these things. So we have Bitcoin, we have Tether. These are the new digital currencies. Bitcoin and Tether as representative of the crypto universe and the stablecoin universe, and the standard digital, for example, a credit card, PayPal, a Giro debit card, which is very common here in Germany, or SEPA, which more or less gives, SEPA is the single European payments area, which gives more or less the same service at the same cost as Giro. So I put some numbers here. For example, Tether, if you want to open up a deposit, it has to be a minimum of 100,000. So it's not for small people, this. And in order to open an account, you have to pay $150 in the United States. Opening up a wallet is not a deposit. A wallet in Bitcoin costs nothing, but when you do a transfer, the fee is uncertain because there is competition among the miners, and they can charge different amounts. So if you look, for example, evidence in the web, as I've done a number of times, to understand exactly how a Bitcoin transaction costs, it's very difficult to get systematic information. Depends on the cases. The deposit in these deposits, I wrote 0 here. A deposit in a bank does not cost really 0. I mean, there are some banks, for example, now that charge you for deposits up to a certain amount. You get certain fees if you make a transfer, if you go to the ATM, etc. But I mean, the fact of having a deposit per unit of time, roughly, it's close to 0. Normally, the banks, when the interest rates are sufficiently high, the banks' returns are given by the difference between the money they lend and the money they borrow from the depositor. So now this is very compressed, but in normal conditions, that's where they get their money. Now, if you do a transfer, for example, with a credit card, it depends, again. 1.3% or 3.5%, so there is a range. This is paid by the retailer. You don't see it. If you make a payment with a credit card or with a Giro card or with PayPal, you don't pay anything because it's a retailer. Now, of course, the retailer will maybe charge you by increasing prices. So, but you don't see this. You don't see this. The time is virtually 0. The time is virtually 0, and of course, money is stable in terms of money, not in terms of good. It's stable, so there's no change here. And that's really drastically different from Bitcoin. I'm sure you know very well, in the last 12 months, and I didn't consider the last 2 or 3 weeks, this minus 35%. It lost 35% of its value. So if you had a deposit, a wallet, Bitcoin, I hope none of you had wallets of Bitcoin, but if you had it, you were pretty disappointed in the last 12 months. So big instability in prices. To go through a transaction, again, it varies, but it takes about 40 minutes because the blocks, the chain blocks of payments have to be validated. It takes a little bit of time. So it's relatively long. In the case of Tether, the transaction is 5 minutes. 5 minutes, and so the Tether is stable. It's supposed to be stable, so the change in value is 0 for Tether, and so far they are successful. But other stable coins have collapsed in recent days, so there you have a little bit of uncertainty. So what the substance here is that if you use one of these digital monies, you can count on the regulation and the insurance to make sure that your deposit is sound, and you can count on the central bank trying to take care as best as they can of the stability of money. Here, you don't have such guarantees. You have to trust the miners, you have to be subject to the uncertainty of a change in value, which can be big, etc. The intermediary can collapse because it's not regulated, etc., etc. There's much more risk here. So that's the conclusion that now people are reaching, is that these two things, and similar, Bitcoin and Tether, crypto and stablecoins, are not really money. They are digital, but they are not really money. They are speculative assets. Speculative assets means parts of wealth on which you can speculate. You can count, you can hope that it has a big increase in value, but you have to be prepared to the possibility that you have a big decrease in value. So it's very speculative assets. They're called speculative, very volatile assets. I'm almost finished, except that I wanted to mention, oops, this doesn't work anymore. I had another slide. I don't know where it ended up, but I will describe it to you. So the other slide, so that's the summing up, which you've already understood. So money is already digital, mainly, except the banknotes. Standard digital monies have solid roots because of rules, because of institutions, which may fail, but at least you can control more or less what they do. New digital currencies, not so much. But partly because they are new. So they are, as yet, they are unregulated, they are evolving, they are changing over time. So this is a new thing that... Now, my postscriptum is on central bank digital currencies. So it's a little bit of an oxymoron, okay? So the digital currency issued by central banks is the paper. So it's supposed to be paper. No, now they are thinking about digital. Central banks are thinking to introduce digital currencies. What is it? Maybe we'll have a discussion later about this thing. But the idea is the central banks have seen all this digital development, the crypto, et cetera. All the world is becoming digital, and they want to catch up. They don't want to be left behind. So they thought, well, we have a technology, it was invented by the Chinese about 9 centuries ago, but it's still paper, it's very old. So why don't we issue central bank cash, digital cash, central bank digital cash? What does this mean in practice? We don't know, because they don't exist yet. Only China has introduced digital cash in some regions. So there are a little bit of experiments, tests going on. But in the West, neither in the US or in Europe or UK or Japan, this thing has not, I mean, there are studies going on, but there's no. So but the idea, more or less, is that people will have in their pocket, in addition to the Giro card or the debit card or the apps in your smartphone that you have, you will have another one, maybe another card or maybe another app, or both. The difference being that it represents value which is deposited not in the banks but in the central bank directly. So there's no intermediation through the banking system. They cut out the banks and go directly to the central bank. With advantages and benefits. Advantages, of course, the central bank in principle is more reliable because they can print money, so they can never fail. But there are drawbacks because the banks also lend money to households, to firms. They give out mortgages, they give credit, consumer credit, etc. So they keep the economy going. And this is not a function that the central banks can import. So if you disintermediate the bank, you take funds away from the banks. The banks are strangled. They don't have the material for doing their work anymore. So there are big pros and cons. And as I said, people are studying, they're scratching their heads. It's not clear to me what's going to happen in order to get the good thing, possibly, about the central bank digital currencies without the drawbacks. And this is something that remains to be seen. I'm finished. I think we now put the chairs and we have it.
Yes, there will be chairs now, and all of you will have the possibility to ask questions through us and through this QR code. Feel free to post your questions.
Don't be intimidated by the lights or by the podium, etc. Ask questions very informally. I'm pretty sure that your question will be very interesting and smart.
Maybe we can start with the CBDCs.
Yeah.
So you explained there are some pros and cons, and China is developing the digital yuan.
Right.
There are cryptocurrencies, especially trendy with the youth. Do you believe such a trend towards digitalization of cash, essentially, is a current trend, or is it a long-term solutions for problems that our economy already faces?
Somebody has defined CBDCs not a problem in search of a solution, but a solution in search of a problem, which is, I think, is a telling definition, saying that the idea is there, and it's very intuitive, okay, because everything turns digital, so why not cash? But the real rationale is still unclear, and the main reason is that the CBDCs should not be either very unsuccessful nor very successful. If they're very unsuccessful, so the people reject them simply because the app that they already have is very convenient, they don't need anything else, then the central banks lose their reputation because they start something which is a flop. Okay, so it should work. I mean, if the central banks, which are big authorities with a reputation, start something like this, it must work to some extent. But it should not work too well, because if it works too well, as I explained a minute ago, all the intermediation goes to the central bank, and the whole credit system collapses. And there is a danger, there are two dangers. One, that the credit mechanism, which relies on banks knowing the clients and knowing who they should lend to and how much and what condition they should give, and all this thing is a wealth of knowledge and expertise that exists in the economy. You don't want it to be lost. The central banks do not possess this expertise. So you want the banks to keep working and do this type of. That's the first danger, that they lose business. The second is the so-called banking run. Now, bank run, as I said a minute ago, banks are risky by definition. If a bank is not risky, in the sense they are not transforming maturities and not taking some risk when they lend, etc., they are not doing their work. So they are inherently risky. So this means that when there is in some moment, for example, a big perception of risk, maybe there is a crisis, okay, and people are afraid of their bank, if they have the possibility to have a very convenient deposit at the central bank, it will be much easier for them to shift from the bank. So there is a risk of what the economists, the financial experts call a bank run. People running not physically to the bank, but digitally, shifting all the money from the banks and therefore making the crisis of the bank even worse. So that's why, as I said, it cannot work very well because otherwise everything moves away, but it should not be a failure. So they need to strike a middle ground. It's very difficult to strike a middle ground in many cases. Now, one of the things that has been proposed is to limit, let's say, for example, maximum 3,000 euro. You can have no more than 3,000 euro CBDC. Why 3,000? What does it mean, 3,000? By the way, 3,000 for each person, you multiply by the population, it's already quite big. So it's sufficient to kill some banks if there is a run. So it's rather complicated. I personally am not sure that everything, I'm not sure that something will actually come out of this. There's no guarantee that they will take the light. It's likely because there is a lot of talk, a lot of study, a lot of preparation, etc. Competition, the Chinese may move. That's another factor. If the Chinese move, there is international competition of currencies. And so the other central banks will be compelled by the fact that I don't think that there is much substitutability between the Chinese currency and the US dollar or the euro. They're very different in many respects. So I don't think that they can easily, but it is a factor. It is a factor, and there is quite a significant imitation effect. You know, what does one central bank, especially among the big ones, one central bank does, also the other one wants to do, and they keep on studying, etc. So there is a certain momentum to these things, but still, you know, we need to understand what they are.
So you said that it will be between the digital money we already have and maybe the CBDCs. Do you still see a future for physical money? Like, do you think if you look into the future from your point of view, in some years from now, will we be still walking around with actual banknotes in our pockets, let's say?
I'm a boy of the 20th century. I'm not, you are boys of the 21st century. So I have a certain attachment to cash, but that's a personal thing. I do believe that cash should stay. First of all, cash is not disappearing. Unlike what you may hear around, the use of cash is increasing in the world quite fast, with the exception of certain countries. Sweden is one. Norway is another. So the Nordics are, the cash in the Nordics is going down quite significantly. Now it's flattened, but it has gone down very significantly. But in most other countries, including Europe, US, etc., the use of cash is going up. First, cash is the only payment instrument which is, first of all, doesn't need any infrastructure to function. So it's completely robust. It's completely, if everything collapses in terms of digital things, and if your computer is destroyed, the cash will always work. And it's the only one, with some exceptions, but it's basically the only one which guarantees finality. Finality means that when a payment is made, cannot be reversed. Okay? So I give you my banknote. As soon as I give my banknote to you, it's certain that I cannot use it anymore because you have it, right? So it's from this point of view, it's less prone to fraud. Okay? So I cannot pay twice with cash. I can pay twice with some of these things, but not with cash. So it has a certain elements of robustness, which in my opinion are good complements of a robust, diversified payment system. So it should exist together with all these other things. Maybe also Bitcoin, not as a money, as a speculative asset. All these things can be used usefully by certain people or categories of investors. But cash should be there, in my opinion, should remain there.
Yes, well, cash has certainly the positive effect of anonymity, which is not that much provided by, for example, other digital forms of money. But, for example, Bitcoin provides this sort of anonymity through replacing the name of the payer with a number that cannot really be traced back. And how do you see the problem with CBDCs and the privacy problem maybe in authoritarian regimes like China?
CBDC will never be private, fully private. If they tell you, don't trust it, because the ledger is there, and so when the record is there, it can always be disclosed. A government comes, or by authority, they pass a law, they change the constitution, whatever, and the central bank has to give them the information. By the way, the same is for Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin tells you that since one of the two keywords is private, and the legend is that this means that privacy is ensured. Not true. The FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States, have been able to trace back the individuals and to put them in jail for transactions in Bitcoin. How do they do it? Even if they don't know the private keyword, they were able to trace the IP, the code of the computer. They are able to find the computer, and from the computer, there it's easier, and you can eventually find the person. So this has happened in the US, and by the way, once you have traced the person, since all the transactions, you know the public keyword of that person, then you can trace all the transactions that person has done. So you can very easily, the policeman, if they have the necessary technical expertise, they are able to discover much more easily the entire business of the person who they have caught. So don't believe that privacy is guaranteed with the central banks, but nor it is with Bitcoin. No, this doesn't work.
Okay.
Yeah, you talked about
This one works.
People and people's identities, even through the CBDCs. I think it's working, isn't it? It's working. Okay, thank you.
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, that's all we need. Yeah, what do you think, seen from the people's perspective, aren't cryptocurrencies much better and much more trustable because you don't have to rely on central banks in terms of, inflation and regulating the money and price stability, which is the main task of central banks? Don't you think that people would prefer it because of the advantages it has, seen from that point?
Some people may. It would not be my opinion, as I think I have explained. I mean, I may trust more or less a central bank, but at least I know the person. I know what rules that person should follow, and I can monitor to some extent what they do. A miner, who are the miners? Do we know the miners? No, we don't. Where are they? In China and Korea, North Korea? Where are the miners? We have no idea who they are. The system gives certain guarantees. For example, the cryptographic problem that they have to solve is produced randomly by computers, etc. But do we trust computers? In the end, it's a philosophical question. I prefer to deal with people than with computers, of course, with the help of computers. And we always have to remain on guard, no matter what institutional construction or what group of people or interest groups we deal with. We have to be suspicious and we have to supervise, we have to oversee what's going on. We should never lose track. But I prefer a system that I understand than a system which is in the end not transparent and I have difficulty understanding.
Talking of trust, in the Euro crisis, the central bank began buying public bonds, government bonds from the private market, from the open market. And is this maybe regarding your own history at the central bank? Was this a contradiction, in contradiction to their original mandate to guarantee price stability? And does this undermine the legitimacy and the trust of the people in the central bank?
To some extent it may, but it depends not so much on the type of operations that they do, which are for most people difficult to understand, but on the reality that they see of how the prices of things that they buy. And so now that's why the present situation is very serious. It's very serious because rate of inflation of 8-9% is something we haven't seen. It's outside of the memory of most people, and there are reasons for that. There have been big shocks, and there is a war now, there's been a pandemic, etc., and all these things, but there is no question that this has not been directly determined, but has been facilitated by the big amount of liquidity that was created. The liquidity, the monetary policy, the expansionary policy of a central bank does not determine inflation in a mechanical way, but it's a facilitator. So if there are other factors that come in, like has been the case now, that push prices up, if liquidity is very large, then it's easier for people to spend. At a certain point, if they start expecting that inflation will come, they spend even more. So that's why we need to be vigilant, and we need to put pressure, which is happening, by the way. I mean, central bankers are under heavy pressure now on both sides of the Atlantic to keep inflation under control. And in the end, they will do it. Maybe costly a little bit, because when money is tightened, then there could be a slowdown of economic activity, unemployment can go up, inequalities may increase, etc. But inflation also generates inequality. So, because inflation hits more the poor people than the rich. That's very important. That's one of the reasons why inflation is bad, that increases social differences, income differences. So I think that, I don't think that either Bitcoin or Tether or any of these guys will solve the problem of inflation. There's no question about that. But I do think that central banks at the moment have a very difficult job. They risk losing their reputation. They should be kept under big stress by the public opinion, politicians and people, the press, the independent press, etc., in order that they ensure that inflation is quickly brought under control.
Yeah, we'll stick with, for our last question, we'll stick with the central banks. You've talked about pressure being put on them and the many problems they have to face too, especially the loss of authority that is coming up. And the question is, do you think that CBDCs are an adequate measure to avoid this loss of authority that comes up through the emerge of other...
CBDCs as such will not have any effect on inflation. So they will either help fight inflation nor hinder the fight against inflation. It's another way of producing. It's money in a different form, but it all depends on how money you create. And as I said, what are the other factors that conjure together with the liquidity to generate inflation? So I don't think that CBDCs have ever been proposed as a way to reduce inflation. So that's they're supposed to perform a different function in the eyes of the support. I'm not a particular supporter of CBDCs. I tend to agree with the opinion that they are a solution in search of a problem, which, by the way, is a definition that was mentioned, but not by somebody in the street, but a very important member of the US Federal Reserve, or the Federal Open Market Committee of the United States. So you see, even in the central banking community, there are lots of differences of opinions about this new instrument, which doesn't exist yet.
So I believe our time has elapsed. Thank you very much for your time, for your talk. And we also have a small present for you. Here, our regional wine.
Liquidity. This is liquidity, no? Shall I start now or drink? No. That's great. That's great. Thanks a lot.